This movie begins with John Oldman, a university professor, who is seen packing his belongings into a pickup truck as he prepares to leave town. Suddenly, a group of his colleagues arrives to throw him a surprise farewell party. They bring everything needed for the party along, hoping to make their last moments with John memorable. However, for some reason, John doesn't seem very pleased to see them. One of the colleagues, Professor Edith, asks John why he's leaving so suddenly without informing anyone, especially since he resigned from the university only 2 days prior. John, however, doesn't provide a clear answer and brushes off her question with a joke. Eventually, his colleagues convince him to stay a little longer and join them for the farewell party. Meanwhile, Edith notices a painting near the truck that shocks her. The painting appears to be an original by Vincent van Gogh, the renowned 19th century artist. She asks John about it, and he casually mentions that it was a gift, so he assumes it must be a replica. But Edith, a professor of art, insists it looks authentic. When she examines the back of the painting, she finds a message written in French that translates to, "For my friend Jacques Bourne." When Edith questions John about Jacques Bourne, he again brushes it off with a joke. The group eventually heads inside John's house, but they remain curious about why John is abruptly leaving such a good job and a comfortable life. The anthropology professor, Dan, begins the questioning. Anthropologists study human origins and evolution, and Dan asks John why he feels the need to leave when everything seems fine. He assures John that they might be able to help if he opens up about his trouble. John replies that there's no issue with the city or his job, but he simply doesn't like staying in one place for too long. He reveals that he has a habit of moving to a new city every 10 years. Dan is surprised and remarks that such a decision might have been understandable 10 years ago, but at John's age, leaving such a stable life doesn't make sense. Edith adds that John hasn't seemed to age a day in the past 10 years. During this discussion, another colleague, Sandy, finds a prehistoric bow in John's house. Everyone is astonished, and Dan asks if John hunts with it. John replies that he mainly uses it to hunt deer. Dan, shocked, comments that hunting with a bow in today's era, when people struggle even with rifles, is almost impossible. John calmly states that he prefers hunting and living naturally. The conversation is interrupted by the arrival of another professor, Art Jenkins, who specializes in archaeology, accompanied by his student Linda. Art presents John with a parting gift, a book he authored about cavemen, which John appreciates. Art, like the others, also questions John's decision to leave, but this time John, slightly irritated, says it's a personal matter and he prefers to keep moving forward in life. To lighten the mood, John brings out an old, expensive bottle of liquor, which cheers everyone up. The party continues with laughter and camaraderie. Later, Dan discovers a stone tool in John's house, a burin used in the Stone Age to craft arrows and hunt. Art, the archaeologist, confirms its authenticity, noting it dates back to prehistoric times. When Dan asks where John found such a rare artifact, John casually says he bought it cheaply from a shop. The group chooses not to press him further, enjoying their time with him instead. Seeing the affection his friends have for him, John becomes emotional and decides to share a secret he's kept hidden from the world. The professors eagerly await his revelation. John begins by asking, "How would you feel if you found out that a caveman from the Stone Age was still alive today?" This bizarre question leaves the professors deep in thought, and they each offer their opinions. Dan, the anthropology professor, theorizes that if a Cro-Magnon man had survived for 14,000 years, he would be incredibly wise and intelligent, yet outwardly appear quite ordinary. He would dress like us, have a family, and possess immense knowledge of history and various fields due to his long life. This sparks a debate about whether a human could biologically survive that long. They turn to Harry, the biology professor, for an explanation. Harry explains that theoretically, human cells are designed to sustain life for up to 190 years, but modern lifestyles with alcohol, junk food, and other toxins act as slow poisons that deteriorate our bodies. However, if someone's body functioned perfectly, regenerating cells properly, they could potentially live for thousands of years. This insight amazes everyone. Harry further elaborates that the pancreas regenerates its cells every 24 hours, the stomach lining every 3 days, and the body as a whole replaces its cells periodically. However, in today's world, poor diet and lifestyle habits disrupt this process. He concludes that if someone maintained a perfect lifestyle, detoxed their body, and supported cell regeneration, they could theoretically achieve extreme longevity. The group is left astonished by this idea. John then surprises everyone by claiming, "I was on that journey with Columbus when he set out to prove the Earth was round. While I was certain the Earth was spherical, part of me still feared that we might fall off the edge of the world." This declaration leaves everyone stunned. Dan asks, Were you drinking before we arrived? Is that why you're saying all this nonsense? John, unfazed, says, look, we have experts from various fields here, so let's treat this as an opportunity to learn something new. Imagine I am the caveman. What are your thoughts? Everyone laughs, thinking it's a joke, but John continues his story. He explains that every 10 years, when people start noticing he doesn't age, he moves away to avoid suspicion. The professors, though skeptical, start taking his theory seriously as John explains how he deduced his age through archaeological data and anthropological research. He recalls that until the age of 34, he aged normally like everyone else, but after turning 35, his aging process completely stopped. He watched his fellow cavemen grow old and die while he remained the same. This caused his tribe to believe he was cursed or stealing their vitality through magic, leading them to exile him. The professors press him for more details, and John admits that he doesn't remember everything clearly, as his memory functions like any other human's. However, he vividly recalls significant events and milestones from his long life. He shares stories of surviving by moving between different tribes and avoiding detection. The group grows more and more intrigued by John's extraordinary claims, setting the stage for a riveting exploration of truth, science, and belief. The professors continue asking John more questions about his life through the ages. John tells them that for the first 2,000 years, the Earth was cold. It was a time when there were towering mountains and glaciers. The sun would hide behind these massive ice sheets, preventing its light from reaching the ground. However, as the climate warmed and the glaciers began to melt, oceans were formed and the continents separated. Hearing this, Professor Art interrupts, saying, all of this is written in books. You haven't told us anything new so far. John responds, yes, I read all of this in books, which helped me recall my memories. Otherwise, it's impossible to remember details from 14,000 years ago. Hearing this, Art's student, Linda, asks, didn't you ever wonder back then where we came from? John replies, in that era, we used to look up at the sky in amazement, believing there were enormous beings up there who created us and the earth. Initially, I thought something was wrong with me. I felt cursed, thinking that's why I couldn't die. Then, I started believing it could be a blessing. Perhaps I was sent to this earth for a specific purpose. Linda then brings up the Van Gogh painting they saw earlier and asks if it's genuine. John replies, yes, it's absolutely original and it was made for me. At that time, I was known as Jacques Bourne and worked as a pig farmer. While I was cleaning the pig pen with my hands, Van Gogh visited, saw me working, and was deeply impressed. He painted that piece right there and we had a long conversation. Linda then asks, if you remember so many old events, why don't you recall the exact place where you were born thousands of years ago? After all, geography doesn't change. John explains, we remember old things only when we see them again. 14,000 years ago, there were forests, rivers, and mountains everywhere. Over time, forests were cleared and massive buildings took their place. That's why it's impossible for me to pinpoint where I was born. John continues, revealing that over the span of 14,000 years, he's been married multiple times. However, he never stayed with his wives for long, leaving them before they discovered his secret. He mentions that he has met his children on several occasions, but always as an older man. When asked how long he's been in America, John says, as the world became interconnected, governments started keeping records of people. This led to complications. In 1862, I was jailed in Belgium for a year for possessing forged documents. After that, during the French immigration wave in 1890, I came to America and have stayed here since. The professors observe that John has an answer for every question, which irritates Art. Frustrated, Art asks, why are you telling us all this? What's your purpose? John calmly replies, you are my good friends. I want to say goodbye to you as my true self, not as the mask I show others. Hearing this, Art storms off into another room, convinced that John has lost his mind. He calls a psychiatrist friend and asks him to come to John's house. Meanwhile, outside, John and Sandy are placing boxes in the truck. Sandy takes this opportunity to confess her feelings for John and asks if he feels the same way. John admits he loves her too, but warns, are you sure you want to stay with me after knowing the truth? Think about what will happen when we have children. You'll see them growing up while I remain the same. Wouldn't that hurt you? I can only stay with you for 10 years. This leaves Sandy speechless, forcing her to reflect on her life. Back inside, the other professors still have many questions for John. They are convinced he is lying and attempt to catch him in his story. Art asks, do you remember any language you spoke 14,000 years ago? John laughs and says, one thing hasn't changed from then until now. Men whistle when they see a beautiful woman. He whistles while looking at Sandy, causing everyone to laugh. Linda asks, Did you ever draw cave paintings in your time? Archaeologists often find these ancient artworks. John replies, "Have you seen the paintings from a place called Lascaux?" When Linda says yes, John reveals, "Those paintings were made by the leader of my tribe, whose name was Giroux. Giroux was a great leader. He painted images of the animals we hunted for food. But one day, during a hunt, he fell face first and broke all his teeth. Unable to chew meat, he had to rely on others to chew it for him before feeding him. Eventually, his jaw became infected, so the tribe left him behind to die and moved on. The group continues questioning John, and he answers every query with ease. He shares how, after thousands of years, the Bronze Age began. People developed languages, built villages and cities, and began worshipping gods. John recounts that as civilization advanced, it became harder for him to stay in one place because people started recognizing him. He reveals, "Since the sun rises in the east, I kept moving eastward. Along the way, I encountered copper for the first time and witnessed people searching for the divine. I learned about many new gods. For 2,000 years, I lived among the Sumerians, the world's first known civilization, and later among the Babylonians." John continues, "Moving further east, I eventually reached India. I was fortunate to arrive during the time of Gautama Buddha. When I first met him, he struck me as an extraordinary and unique individual. I had never met anyone like him in my entire life. Inspired by him, I became his disciple and stayed with him, learning until his death. Buddha suspected there was something unusual about me, but I never revealed my truth to him." Art, already frustrated with John's claims, asks, "What if we tell others about you? What then?" John replies, "Even if you tell someone, they won't believe you. And even if you do believe me today, as time passes, these stories will start to feel absurd and you'll eventually forget them." At that moment, the psychiatrist, Dr. Will, arrives. After hearing John's story, Will assumes John is deceiving everyone. However, some of the others begin to believe John and urge him to continue. Will asks, "If you've been alive for 14,000 years, have you never fallen ill?" John admits, "Around 300 years ago, I might have had pneumonia. Later, I contracted yellow fever, malaria, and, more recently, chickenpox. However, my body never shows scars, so even chickenpox left no marks." This revelation astonishes Harry, the biologist, who requests John to come to his lab for testing before leaving. John declines, saying, "If I agree to testing, my secret will be exposed, and people will start experimenting on me like a lab specimen." The conversation turns to education, and John reveals that he holds degrees in 10 different fields, including one in biology, which he earned from Oxford in 1840. However, as time passed and science advanced, much of what he had studied became outdated. John continues answering every question with ease, which frustrates Dr. Will, who suddenly pulls out a gun and aims it at John. This shocks everyone, and for a moment, the entire room falls silent. Dr. Will declares that if John has truly lived for 14,000 years and survived all major diseases and plagues, it means he must be immortal. To test this, he says he will shoot John. John calmly responds that he has never claimed to be immortal. His survival is simply due to nature. Will retorts, "Fine, I'll just shoot your hand and see if the wound heals without leaving a scar." Everyone stops Will from pulling the trigger, and he storms out of the house in anger. Harry then explains to the group that Will had recently lost his wife to cancer, which had deeply affected him. Perhaps this grief pushed him to act irrationally. Hearing this, John rushes after Will to console him and takes his gun, fearing that Will might harm himself in his frustration. Meanwhile, the professors inside are eager to hear more of John's story, though some of them begin to feel envious. They are reminded of how their loved ones have passed with time, yet John has continued living for millennia. This reflects a common human emotion, envy of others' happiness and success, even when it comes to friends and family. John continues his tale, sharing that in the 17th century, he met another man with similar longevity. Just like John, this man was living an extraordinarily long life. They spent 2 days together, sharing stories and providing evidence of their experiences. They promised to stay in touch but never met again. However, 200 years later, John believed he saw this man at a railway station, but before he could approach him, the man disappeared into the crowd. The professors then ask John a question that excites them all, whether he ever met any significant religious figure or spiritual leader worshipped today. John replies that he does not believe in any religion or God. He explains that when he met Gautama Buddha, he was profoundly influenced by Buddha's teachings and wanted to spread them across the world to stop people from fighting in the name of religion. John continues, "After leaving India, I went to Europe, where I started sharing these ideas in Rome. However, the Romans rejected these thoughts and exiled me from their city. From there, I moved to Eastern Europe and settled in a small village, where I taught Buddha's teachings to the locals. They were so impressed that they began worshipping me and even built a large statue of me. Over time, my teachings gained popularity, but I was disheartened when people turned my ideas into a new religion and made me their god. They spread this religion further and converted others to it. Eventually, the Roman authorities perceived this religion as a threat and crucified me. Hearing this, the professors are stunned as they realize John is claiming to be Jesus Christ and that the religion he's describing is Christianity. John explains, "When I was crucified, I endured the pain and used a technique I had learned in Tibet to stop my heartbeat temporarily. The Romans thought I was dead, so they removed me from the cross and placed me in a tomb. Gradually, my heartbeat resumed and I revived myself. When I was about to leave the tomb secretly, some of my followers saw me and believed I had been resurrected. I left the area to avoid further attention, but the stories of my resurrection spread far and wide. The professors, skeptical, ask, 'If you were crucified, then there should be scars on your hands from the nails.' John responds, 'There were no nails. I was only tied to the cross.' The story about nails being hammered into my hands was fabricated later to make it sound more dramatic. My body always heals without scars." This explanation sparks doubt among the group once more, and they grow increasingly frustrated. Professor Edith, a devout Christian, becomes angry and argues with John, insisting that the Bible is true and that Jesus genuinely performed miracles, walked on water, and resurrected the dead. She accuses John of lying. John calmly replies, "I never intended to create a religion. I simply wanted to share Buddha's teachings so people would stop fighting over faith. I never walked on water or resurrected anyone." These stories were exaggerated over time. John compares Christianity to pagan mythology, which enrages Edith, but Dan supports John, explaining, "The early leaders of Christianity adopted many elements from Hebraic texts and pagan traditions to form their religion. Even Buddha and Jesus shared similar teachings about compassion, tolerance, brotherhood, and love." John says, "I taught people these ideas, but over time, they became distorted into myths. Concepts like heaven and hell were introduced to instill fear and control people. At this moment, Dr. Will return." John's comparison of himself to Jesus visibly affects Edith, who becomes emotional and says, "For 2,000 years, we've believed in Christianity. Why are you trying to shatter our faith?" John explains, "Throughout history, humans have believed in many religions for extended periods, only for their beliefs to evolve or fade. Today, the foundations of churches worldwide rest on stories akin to fairy tales." When the professors ask John how he got the name Jesus, he says, "I never changed my name. I've always been John. However, as stories of my resurrection spread, people interpreted my name differently in various regions. The meaning of these names translated to God is merciful. Over time, the name evolved first to Lysis in Latin, and eventually to Jesus." Edith, still in disbelief, declares, "This cannot be true. You cannot be Jesus." John replies, "One day on a hill, I was teaching what I had learned from Buddha. A few people were sitting there and I gave them a choice to decide for themselves who they thought I was. Today, I give you the same choice." His words carry such depth and sincerity that the professors begin to believe his story is true. They feel as though their faith in God has been completely shattered. Dr. Will, however, remains unconvinced and accuses John of seeking attention. He demands that John admit the truth. After a long pause, John suddenly says, "Yes, it's all just a story. I was only telling you a fictional tale." He explains that seeing professors from various fields gathered in one place, and after receiving Art's gift of a book about cavemen, he got the idea for this story. Disappointed, the professors criticize John and leave one by one. Dan, who had supported John throughout and nearly believed he was a divine being, feels utterly betrayed. He angrily confronts John before storming out. Only John and his girlfriend Sandy remain. Sandy, convinced that everything John said was true, asks him, "How many names have you used?" John replies, "I've never changed my first name, only my surnames." He lists them, then adds, 60 years ago, I was at Harvard and my name was John Thomas Partee." Hearing this, Dr. Will, who had re-entered the room, is shocked. He says, "That's impossible. Were you teaching chemistry there?" John replies, "Yes, I was." Will, in disbelief, asks, "What was my mother's name?" John answers, "It was Nola." Will then asks, "Before I was born, we had a pet dog. What was its name?" John replies, "Its name was Wolf." Both answers are correct. Realizing John is his father, Will becomes emotional and asks, "Why did you leave my mother? Why did you abandon us?" John replies, "Now you know why I left." Overcome with grief, Will suffers a heart attack and dies on the spot. For the first time, John witnesses one of his children die in his arms, leaving him deeply shaken. An ambulance arrives to take Will's body away. Meanwhile, Dan, holding the prehistoric artifact he took from John's house, walks away, still wondering if John's story was true. John, on the other hand, gets into his car to leave forever. He stops a short distance away and waits for Sandy. Although John believed that Sandy wouldn't want to stay with him after learning the truth, her love for him remains unwavering. She joins him and together they drive off, bringing the film to a close. Give a thumbs up if you like the video and do subscribe to the channel for next such video.